morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this Lunch and Learn. We're going to be thinking about poor performance today, and we're particularly going to be thinking about what might be in a toolkit that you might need to help your people address poor performance issues. As I said before, I will be talking for about 20-25 minutes, and then sometime between 20 and 25 past 12, we will finish the recording and I'll switch the recording off, and then we can have a conversation that is much more open and free, and you can put your questions in. So I encourage you to turn your videos off at this stage, so I don't think it will necessarily show up. So here we are, dealing with poor performance. This is our only little advert. For those of you who don't know us, we tend to work with organisations where people have been promoted into senior roles, management roles, because they're technically, professionally or academically very able, and not necessarily because they're great people managers. So higher education, public sector, accountants, solicitors, technology developers, the Atomic Energy Authority, mining companies, engineers, all of those sorts of people, many organisations, they encourage many people to take on management roles without necessarily having people management as their number one skill, which is fine, absolutely great. That's what we're here to support. So what am I sharing today? We're going to talk about the real problems involved in poor performance, have a look at a toolkit, and particular why just learning how to have a difficult conversation often doesn't solve the problem, and then thinking about some of the things that you might expect in a toolkit around analysis, option development, choices, and purpose that can help people move from, oh, I've got to have a difficult conversation, into this is the outcome that I want, and perhaps finding the conversation easier than they thought. So I think the first thing to think about is, when you're talking to your teams, is really to help people understand actually what is the problem with having a poor performer. Because a number of managers are going, yeah, they're not doing a very good job, but do you know what? It's not my number one problem at the moment. And if the problem is only very minor, then maybe it isn't their number one problem. But what we know for many people is that having a poor performer on the team actually has a lot of ramifications which they may not see. So it is worth taking some time to think about the reality of poor performance. And one of the problems of having a poor performer on team is that it ends up stressing out the manager. And it might well be that many managers don't realise that their stress is often caused by somebody not doing the work properly. They might be having to pick up other work. They might having to be asked one of their team to pick up extra work. They might themselves be worrying. They might end up with a poor performance review because they haven't dealt with their team, and they might even fail to progress because they're not seen as dealing with their team. So when we tend to think of, oh, I've got a poor performer on my team, we often don't realise fully the impact that it's having on us. And I think it's really worthwhile taking some time to reflect on the full impact that that performance has on us, because that's part of our motivation to deal with it, and part of us helping to understand what we need to do about it. And of course, if it's a problem for us, it's a problem for the team. And I'm sure that many of you will know some of that main research that shows the biggest single thing that upsets high performers and good performers in an organisation is the weaker people not being dealt with. Right. So if people are allowed to get away with underperforming, whatever that might be, and it might be that it's all about, not turning up on time, or it might be not delivering their work on time, or delivering work that's not good enough and needs redoing, whatever it is, it burdens the rest of the team. And I've listed there some of the ways in which it burdens the team. And some of the more dramatic things it does is it reduces the team's respect for you as a manager, because it leads the team to go, well, they're not dealing with it. it demotivates the team and think, well, if they can get away with it, why am I putting in all this extra work? And ultimately, the best people will go, why on earth do I want to sit around in this team where people are allowed to get away with whatever they're allowed to get away with? I'm moving on, whether that's trying to find another job in the organization or moving out altogether. So it really is a major, major, major issue once you've got real performance issues going on in a team. And that performance can be about capability, about are they actually doing a good job? It can be about their attitude to other people. It might be about something as simple as there are people not being aware of what impact they're having on others. Poor performance takes on many, many, many things. But all of those things end up having repercussions. So even though I'm sure in one sense you know that, I would urge you to really think about that. And when you're sharing this material with your colleagues, as I'm sure that is why a number of you are here, then you need to spend some time on this. So why do difficult conversations fail? A number of you may well have put in or been part of the how to have a difficult conversation. And there's good reasons why they fail even after we've had the training. And one is that they are difficult and actually we don't get to have them all that often. And so we don't build up practice in it. We don't build up skills because hopefully we're not having difficult conversations all day, every day, that in theory, as we deal with problems, then they resolve themselves. But they're often based on some false assumptions. So if we have a difficult conversation that's not actually about the real problem, we're unlikely to address the real problem. And that's one of the reasons why working out what the real problem is vital. Sometimes we don't see how our colleague perceives the problem. So if they don't perceive the problem in the way that we perceive the problem, our difficult conversation may not bring us either to having a shared view of the problem or even agreeing what the actual problem is. More often than not, and we've all been guilty of this, very often managers fail to see their own contribution to the problem. Now, sometimes that might be as simple as, well, I should have dealt with it ages ago and I haven't. But there can be other things. So did I set a clear objective? Have I changed my mind? Have I made the resources available? Have I actually set them up to fail? And that happens more often than we realise. A number of the cases that we deal with in poor performance, and certainly a number of things that end up in employee relations problems, are often built around people being set up to fail, even though that isn't what we intended. If we don't have a real view of what the actual potential solution is to the problem, then we can struggle to get to the right solution. So if we haven't understood the actual problem, we're unlikely to come to a solution that will address the actual problem. And so often in difficult conversations, we're taught to work with the person we're talking to try to develop a solution that will work for them. And one of the challenges is if we don't know what solution will work for them, both of you can end up often agreeing something that isn't really going to work. And that leads to setting someone up to fail. And then that leads to even more problems because your employee says, well, I had my conversation with you. We agreed that I would do this and I did do this and you're still not happy. And that's where we run into all sorts of dynamics around expectations, around objectives, around grievances, and so on. And finally, we can have false assumptions about the emotional intent that is driving both the employee and the manager. So very often, by the time you're getting to have a difficult conversation, the manager is in a place where they have started to believe that the person they need to have this difficult conversation with is actively choosing to perform badly, behave badly, be difficult, be awkward. They're already projecting emotion onto the other person. And possibly the employee coming in going, they've already made up their mind. This isn't going to be a fair conversation. I know that they don't like me, etc., etc. So the emotional intent behind a lot of difficult conversations often really damages the potential outcome. So what can we do? Why do these things matter? The first thing then we need is to actually set people up properly so that before we get anywhere near having a difficult conversation, we actually analyze what's going on. And if we haven't dealt with poor performance for a long time, often what's happened is some aspects of poor performance have appeared in order to cover up another problem of performance. And so we don't, until we work out what the real problem is, we're often tackling the symptoms and not the causes. The next thing we need to do is really think through all the potential outcomes of dealing with a situation. And this partly helps the managers deal with fear by facing in the face. So if they say, I could not tackle this situation, and miraculously everything could get better. Now, if they believe that that's actually quite likely to happen, then I would let that happen, providing you can make it happen in a real time frame. But mostly a miraculous resolution of the problem isn't going to happen, or else we wouldn't be thinking about the difficult conversation in the first place. So we might go, well, I analyze the problem properly, I get to a solution, I have a good conversation with my person, we come to an agreed solution, and it all comes out really well, right? That's a great outcome. Or we might go right to the other end and go, I have a terrible conversation, I feel really upset, they get really upset, they resign, or they get really upset, they launch a grievance, or I walk out of there vowing I'm never going to talk to them again. Now, that's a disastrous outcome. In between those are many more realistic outcomes of what is realistically potential outcomes of dealing with this situation. And then what needs to happen is, before you get into a conversation with your colleague, you really need to have thought through what outcomes are deliverable that will work for you. And there may be several, but you need to go into a difficult conversation with a view of where you need to get to, right? So that you may not get there. And in the meeting, the person that you're talking to may indeed come up with a solution that you hadn't thought of that you can take somewhere else. But it is better to change a plan than not have a plan. And therefore, choosing one or more outcomes that are deliverable and designing what you're going to do to get to those is absolutely crucial and fair to the person that you're working with. Because if in the meeting you and your colleague end up agreeing to something that isn't really going to work, then you are setting them up to fail. And I have seen that happen so often, because people end up thinking the real purpose of this meeting is to agree something. And they come up there going, oh, we both agreed this. And that's actually not the aim of it. The aim of it is to resolve the problem in whatever way we can. So if that's the toolkit, let's just think through why some of these things matter. So why do we analyze? And again, in our toolkits, we absolutely have analytical tools, but it's worth thinking about what are the richer things going on. So if we've lived with a problem for a long time, it's easy to think, oh, I know what that is, right? So, but if we've left something for a long time, other problems will have arisen that will have masked it. So, for example, let us say that someone is not very good at using an Excel spreadsheet, right? We've lived with that for a very long time. So what actually we're now seeing is that we have perhaps lowered our expectations, or that the person who is not able to use their Excel spreadsheet is not delivering their work on time. So we, instead of seeing it as a capability issue, we actually see it as an attitude issue that they're not delivering on time. Or we might experience it as a very defensive issue where they defend their work even though it's not defendable, right? And that's just something fairly simple around a capability piece. If you've got a behavioural piece where, for example, one person in the team has been allowed to talk over other people because perhaps they're more senior, tackling that problem may emerge all sorts of other problems that sit underneath. Why is this person talking over everyone else? So we will give you analytical tools. I'm sure you may have some yourself, but it's really important to analyze the problem. And for managers coming in and seeing problems in a team where poor performance has been allowed to fester, and I'm sure many of you have been there, and we hear endless stories of managers coming in and going, well, they've always been told they were great and they're not. Now what do I do? Taking some time to work out what is the problem is vital. Now, then people then go, all right, I've now worked out the problem. What's the solution? And my big message to them there is don't get stuck thinking that there's only one possible outcome, because there's always more than one possible outcome to a solution. I mean, unless you are in a total disciplinary where somebody has to leave the business, right? That's not the situation that we're talking about here. We're talking about here a situation of poor performance that is resolvable, not a disciplinary, not a sackable disciplinary offence here. So learning how to create multiple outcomes is a key part of thinking about how do I deal with poor performance. It's also actually a very good way of thinking about lots of things when you are in managing people, to get out of the mindset that there's only one way to deal with a problem, because people are multifaceted, they're not simple, and therefore people will respond in different ways to the different ways in which you handle them. And none of those ways may be perfect, but some will be better than others. But you will be able to have some thoughts about that. So definitely encourage your people to think of multiple good outcomes, as well as thinking about the outcomes they really don't want. And then what do they need to do in order to avoid the outcomes that they really don't want? And they may need your support, or they may be able to work that out themselves. And then they have to make a choice. So I'm aware that this can be controversial, but it is also helpful for leaders to feel that if they are responsible for dealing with poor performance, then they have some agency in deciding what is an acceptable solution. The flip side of that is that then they shouldn't agree to setting up someone to fail. Now, in my book, I know some of you have read it, some of you haven't, are waving for the camera here. In my book, one of the examples I give actually comes from the civil service of an employee struggling on a capability level, and the manager realizing that and wanting to make changes but not knowing how to do it, and the manager above saying, set them some objectives, either they make them and they keep the job or they don't. And my view about that was, if you know they won't succeed on those objectives, kidding yourself that you're giving them a chance is the wrong strategy, because what you're doing is you're setting them up to fail, and that has all sorts of negative fallout. So make some choices and then plan. And if it's quite a difficult conversation, you might need an HR business partner to help you, or you might get a colleague, but really, really, really be thinking through, how am I going to get to my desired outcome? What do I need to prepare? How might the conversation go? And if there are other aspects to your plan around setting standards, around timelines, around documents, then make sure that you are aware of those before you begin. If you come to a different possible solution in the meeting to one you thought of, don't feel bounced into tying down all the details of what that solution looks like in the meeting. Agree with the person that this looks like a good solution, but give yourselves time, both of you, to go away and go, all right, if this is the way to deal with this poor performance, let's lay out what that might look like, but give ourselves time to think about it. And crucially, if they need additional resources in order to deliver what you've agreed that they deliver, you need to provide those resources. And if you can't provide those resources, then your solution is not a solution. And once again, you're setting them up to fail. So those are the core elements of the basic toolkit about thinking. And then you need to get into training resources. And I'm not going to talk a lot about training here, but an awful lot of training around poor performance focuses on the HR process of when does poor performance become a disciplinary, what do you have to do, what do you have to document, etc., etc. And that increases a manager's anxiety about an employee grievance. But also it doesn't go anywhere near addressing how the manager feels, what their own anxieties are, what their own desires are, what their own experience of managing poor performance has been in the past. And crucially, it fails to examine the emotional intent in the context of a poor performance workshop. So if you have a 1 hour or 2 hour session on having a difficult conversation, they tend to be quite process oriented and only focused on the conversation and not on what's coming in, how we're going to deal with perspective, on emotions, and on potential solutions. So when you think about it, for a conversation to go well, a manager needs absolute clarity about what performance is acceptable. And that is different to what is unacceptable. Sometimes it can be very easy. Don't do this. Don't be late. I need you here by 9 o'clock, not 9:05, right? But mostly poor performance conversations aren't that simple. So in training, they need help to understand how to have a full conversation which goes through the processes of, this is my understanding of the problem, here's some solutions for the problem, how do you feel about that, are you going to engage with that, what are we going to do next, in a structured way, having done all the thinking first. All right, it is a lot more difficult than just having difficult conversations training. And I think I did put some of those in. So as we said, it focuses on process anxiety, feelings, and ignores the manager's potential as part of the problem. But when it works, it should give people confidence to deal with poor performance. We should, with a toolkit, be able to help people deal with their personal feelings about the situation, ensure that managers recognise where they've contributed to the problem, and our toolkits use a lot of case studies to really help people dig into knotty problems and find out what's really going on.